So far in this tutorial, we've went over Axios and ExpressRouter. We have yet to see ReactRouter, but in this section, I'll just briefly summarize these three libraries and how they work together. So let's first start with Axios. So Axios is what we'll use to communicate with our server through API calls. And we actually saw this in the very first section, if you remember. And again, remember how we did this. In Axios, we did /hello, which matched the path in our Express server, so our API returned a simulated server response, which was, remember, just a string of hello world. And Axios can communicate with any other endpoint as well. And remember, we saw this with the JSON placeholder. We made requests from Axios to the JSON placeholder endpoint, which gave us a simulated server response. And finally, Axios is promise-based. And remember, a promise is just a data type for working with asynchronous requests. So because Axios is promise-based, we don't really have to transform our data. Once it's retrieved from the server, Axios automatically resolves the promise. This also allows us to chain .then statements, which allow us to run certain functions after the promise resolves. Next, we have ExpressRouter. ExpressRouter is mainly used to communicate with our database. And ExpressRouter can communicate with our database because it uses Node as the runtime environment. And remember, Node can execute code outside of the browser. And this is essentially what allows SQL queries to be possible. And again, we can't do this with Axios. We can't pass in SQL queries directly from Axios in our React client-side app. And Express is also a more secure way to make HTTP requests. It has certain libraries like Helmet, which update the headers and just make the overall HTTP requests more secure. And the promise resolving just means the server successfully returned some data. But of course, the obvious downside is that Express is server-side only. But we're allowed to communicate with Express through React, through cours. And we will discuss cours in more detail in the next section. And finally, we have ReactRouter. ReactRouter is essentially used to navigate within our app. We can't make any API calls with ReactRouter. It is only for navigating our React app. And at this point, you might be wondering how our app knows that whether a route is ReactRouter or an Express API call. And the answer is that it handles all of this behind the scenes. When we make a route, the first thing that's checked is if the route is for ReactRouter. If not, if none of the paths match for ReactRouter, then it's moved on to the Express server where it's checked if any of the routes match. And this is how routing is handled and how our app knows the difference between ReactRouter and Express.